Picture this. It's a quiet evening in the year 1347. The sun has just set behind the massive stone walls of Warwick Castle. The only sounds are the gentle crackling of torches in their iron brackets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft footsteps of night watchmen making their rounds along the battlements. Tonight we're going to explore the fascinating, yet wonderfully mundane world of medieval castle defences. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's take a peaceful journey back in time to discover how these incredible fortresses were protected and what daily life was really like for those who called them home. Medieval castles weren't just homes for nobility. They were complex military installations designed with one primary purpose in mind: defense. Every single element of a castle's design, from the placement of windows to the width of doorways, was carefully considered with security in mind. Imagine walking through the countryside of 12th century England or France. You'd see these massive stone structures rising from hilltops, their grey walls stretching high into the sky, dominating the landscape for miles around. These weren't just impressive buildings, they were statements of power, symbols of authority, and most importantly, they were incredibly sophisticated defensive systems that had evolved over hundreds of years. The people who lived in these castles didn't just wake up one morning and decide to build a fort. Castle construction was a slow, methodical process that could take decades to complete. Master masons, skilled craftsmen, and hundreds of labourers would work together, stone by stone, to create these marvels of medieval engineering. But what made these castles so difficult to attack? What clever defensive mechanisms did medieval engineers develop? And what was it actually like to live inside these walls when war was at your doorstep? Let's explore these questions together at a nice, gentle pace. The first and perhaps most important defensive feature of any medieval castle was its location. Castle builders were incredibly strategic about where they placed their fortresses. They didn't simply choose the prettiest spot in the countryside. Most castles were built on elevated ground, hilltops, ridges, or rocky outcrops that provided natural advantages. From these high positions, defenders could see approaching enemies from miles away. The higher elevation also made it much more difficult for attackers to bring heavy siege equipment up steep slopes. Imagine trying to push a massive wooden catapult up a muddy hillside while arrows are raining down on you from above. Many castles were also positioned near rivers or coastlines, not just for the convenience of water transport, but because water formed a natural barrier. Rivers could be diverted to create additional obstacles, and coastal castles could receive supplies and reinforcements by sea, even during a prolonged siege. The layout of a typical castle followed what we call the concentric design: multiple rings of defense, each one more secure than the last. Picture peeling an onion, layer by layer. That's essentially how castle defenses work. An attacker would have to overcome multiple obstacles, each one becoming progressively more challenging. The outermost ring often consisted of a large outer bailey, an enclosed courtyard, surrounded by a wooden palisade or stone wall. This area housed workshops, stables, storage buildings, and living quarters for servants and soldiers. During peacetime, this was a bustling area of activity, with blacksmiths hammering at their forges, cooks preparing meals in outdoor kitchens, and children playing in the courtyard. But during times of conflict, this outer bailey would be quickly abandoned, with all valuable supplies and people moved to more secure inner areas. The outer bailey served as the first line of defense, designed to slow down attackers and force them to reveal their numbers and tactics. When most people think of castle defenses, the first thing that comes to mind is usually the moat. that wide band of water surrounding the castle walls. But medieval moats were far more sophisticated than many people realize. Not all moats were filled with water. In fact, many of the most effective moats were dry ditches, sometimes called fosses. These dry moats could be incredibly deep, often 30 to 40 feet deep, and just as wide. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these ditches on a misty morning, looking down into the shadows below. The sides of these moats were deliberately cut at steep angles, making them nearly impossible to climb without special equipment. The bottom would often be lined with sharp wooden stakes, called caltrops, or littered with loose rocks and debris that would make footing treacherous for anyone who managed to reach the bottom. Water-filled moats, when they were used, served multiple purposes beyond just creating a barrier. The water was usually diverted from nearby streams or rivers through an ingenious system of channels and sluice gates. Castle engineers could control the water level, sometimes draining sections of the moat for maintenance, or flooding specific areas to create additional obstacles. These water-filled moats weren't stagnant pools, they were living ecosystems, often stocked with fish that provided food for the castle's inhabitants. Swans, ducks, and other waterfowl would make their homes in the moat, creating a surprisingly peaceful environment during times of peace. The gentle sound of water lapping against stone walls, the soft quacking of ducks, the splash of a fish jumping, these sounds would have been constant companions to those living within the castle walls. But moats served another, less obvious purpose. They prevented undermining. One of the most effective methods of attacking a castle wall was to dig tunnels underneath the foundations, then collapse the tunnel to bring down a section of wall. A water-filled moat made this nearly impossible, as any tunnel would immediately flood. Crossing a moat required a bridge, and medieval castle bridges were marvels of engineering in their own right. The most famous type was the drawbridge, a wooden platform that could be raised and lowered using a system of chains, pulleys, and counterweight. The mechanisms for operating these drawbridges were housed in special chambers above the gate, operated by teams of men turning large wooden wheels. Picture the scene on a quiet morning: the creak of wooden wheels turning slowly, the rattle of heavy chains, the gentle splash as the drawbridge is lowered to rest on stone supports on the far side of the moat. The entire process would take several minutes, and the sounds would echo across the water and surrounding countryside. Medieval gatehouses weren't simple doorways. They were complex, multi-story structures that were essentially mini-fortresses in their own right. The most sophisticated gatehouses featured multiple gates, each one a separate barrier that attackers would have to overcome. The first gate might be a simple wooden door, but behind it lay a long, narrow passage called a barbican. This passage was deliberately designed to funnel attackers into a confined space where they could be easily targeted by defenders. The walls of the barbican were lined with murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which defenders could drop stones, pour boiling water, or shoot arrows down onto anyone trying to force their way through. These murder holes had an almost mundane quality to them. During peace, just dark square openings in the stone ceiling above. But during an attack, they became deadly focused points of defense. Walking through a medieval gatehouse during peacetime would have been an interesting experience. Your footsteps would echo off the stone walls, and you'd pass through multiple chambers, each one serving a different purpose. There might be guard rooms where soldiers could rest between shifts, storage areas for weapons and supplies, and living quarters for the gatehouse commander and his family. The gates themselves were massive affairs, thick oak doors reinforced with iron bands and studs. Behind the wooden gates, many castles also featured iron portcullises, heavy metal grills that could be lowered to block the passage even if the wooden gates were breached. The mechanism for raising and lowering a portcullis required several men working together, turning capstans and managing counterweights. Imagine the sound of a portcullis being lowered, the screech of metal against stone, the rattle of chains, the deep, resonant boom as the heavy iron grate settled into its groove in the floor. It was a sound that meant security for those inside, that spelled doom for any attacker caught beneath it. Some of the most advanced gatehouses featured what was called a bent entrance. Rather than passing straight through the gatehouse, visitors had to make a sharp turn, sometimes even a complete U-turn, before reaching the inner courtyard. This design served two purposes. It prevented attackers from using a battering ram effectively, since they couldn't build up a straight-line assault, and it meant that anyone entering the gatehouse was exposed to defensive fire from multiple angles. The rooms above the gatehouse were often among the most comfortable in the entire castle. The gatehouse commander and his family might live in apartments that featured large windows overlooking the approach to the castle, fireplaces for warmth, and private latrines built into the thick walls. These windows served a dual purpose. They provided light and air during peaceful times, but they were also strategic observation points that allowed defenders to monitor anyone approaching the castle. During the long, quiet hours of a medieval night, guards would take turns walking the walls of the gatehouse, their leather boots soft against the stone walkways. They carried lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and they would call out gentle watchwords to each other to confirm that all was well. All is well on the eastern wall. All is well at the gate. These calls would echo softly through the night air, a reassuring rhythm that helped everyone in the castle sleep peacefully. The walls of a medieval castle were far more than simple barriers. They were sophisticated engineering systems designed to withstand both the elements and enemy attacks. The construction of castle walls was a slow, meticulous process that could take years to complete for even a single section. Castle walls were typically built using what's called rubble-fill construction. The outer faces of the wall were made from carefully cut and fitted stones, but the interior was filled with smaller stones, mortar, and sometimes even earth. This created walls that were incredibly thick, often 8 to 12 feet thick at the base, and sometimes even thicker. The base of castle walls was usually built with a pronounced outward slope called a battered base. This sloping section served multiple purposes. It made the wall more stable, it caused drop stones to bounce outward toward attackers, and it made it nearly impossible for attackers to place ladders effectively against the wall. At the top of the walls ran the wall walk or parapet, a walkway that allowed defenders to move safely along the length of the wall. These walkways were protected by crenellations, the distinctive up and down pattern that most people associate with castle walls. The raised portions, called merlons, provided cover for defenders, while the gaps between them, called embrasures or crenelles, allowed archers to shoot through. But crenellations weren't just functional, they were also symbols of state. In medieval England, only those with special royal permission were allowed to crenellate their walls. It was called a license to crenellate, and it was a mark of prestige and authority. Walking along a castle's wall walk on a quiet evening would have been a peaceful experience. The stone beneath your feet would still hold warmth from the day's sun, and you could look out over the surrounding countryside, watching the last light fade from the sky. The wind would whisper through the crenellations, creating soft, almost musical sounds as it passed over the stone. Many castle walls featured small towers at regular intervals. These towers, called mural towers or interval towers, projected outward from the main wall line. This design allowed defenders in the towers to shoot along the face of the wall, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground where attackers could take shelter. The towers themselves were marvels of medieval architecture. They typically featured multiple floors, each one serving a different purpose. The ground floor might be used for storage, with thick walls and small windows. The upper floors would house living quarters for soldiers or minor nobles, with larger windows and more comfortable furnishing. The spiral staircases in these towers were always built to turn clockwise as you climbed up. This wasn't random, it was a deliberate defensive feature. Since most people are right-handed, an attacker climbing the stairs would have their sword arm cramped against the central column, while a defender coming down the stairs would have more room to swing their weapon. Castle walls also featured numerous smaller defensive elements that might not be immediately obvious to a casual observer. Small openings called arrow loops or arrow slits were cut into the walls at regular intervals. These openings were wider on the inside than on the outside, allowing archers to shoot out while presenting the smallest possible target to enemy archers. The construction of these arrow loops was an art form in itself. The stone had to be cut precisely to create the correct angles, and the interior chamber had to be large enough for an archer to draw his bow while still providing maximum protection. Some arrow loops were designed specifically for crossbows, with horizontal slits that accommodated the different shooting motion required for these weapons. During construction, master masons would carefully supervise every aspect of wall building. They would test each stone for quality, mix mortar to precise specifications, and ensure that each course of stones was perfectly level. The sound of construction would have been constant during building seasons. The ring of hammers on stone, the scrape of trowels spreading mortar, the creak of wooden scaffolding, and the calls of workers coordinating their effort. The towers of a medieval castle were its most distinctive and important defensive feature. These tall, imposing structures served multiple purposes. They provided elevated observation points, housed the castle's most important residents, and served as the final refuge if the outer defences were breached. The most important tower in any castle was usually the keep, or donjon, the central stronghold that formed the heart of the fortress. These keeps were massive structures, often rising 100 feet or more above the surrounding walls. The walls of a keep were typically even thicker than the castle's main walls, sometimes reaching 15 or 20 feet in thickness at the base. Building a castle keep was an enormous undertaking that could take a decade or more to complete. Picture the scene during construction. Teams of oxen pulling heavy stone blocks up wooden ramps, master craftsmen carefully fitting each stone into place, and the constant activity of dozens of workers moving materials and tools. The entrance to a keep was always elevated above ground level, typically accessed by a wooden staircase that could be destroyed in case of attack. This meant that the ground floor of most keeps had no external entrance at all. It was a secure storage area for the castle's most valuable possessions and emergency supplies. The interior of a keep was divided into multiple floors, each one serving a specific purpose. The Great Hall was usually on the second floor, a large, impressive room where the lord of the castle would hold court, entertain guests, and conduct the business of running his domain. These great halls were often magnificent spaces, with high vaulted ceilings, large windows, and elaborate decorations. Above the great hall were the private chambers of the lord and his family. These rooms were more comfortable and luxurious than most people of the time could imagine. They featured large fireplaces, glass windows, a luxury in medieval times, and private latrines built into the thickness of the walls. The windows in these upper chambers were larger than those in the lower floors, since they were high enough to be relatively safe from enemy arrows. The very top of the keep often featured a flat roof surrounded by battlements, creating an observation platform and final defensive position. From here, defenders could see for miles in every direction, spotting approaching enemies while they were still far away. Signal fires could be lit to warn neighboring castles, and messages could be sent using flags or mirrors during daylight hours. Other towers in the castle complex served more specialized purposes. Corner towers provided strong points at the most vulnerable angles of the wall. Gate towers controlled access to different sections of the castle. Some towers were built specifically as residential quarters for important guests or high-ranking members of the household. The construction techniques used for towers were particularly sophisticated. The corners were built using quoins, specially cut stones that interlock to provide maximum strength. The circular towers that became popular in later medieval periods were even stronger, as they had no corners that could be undermined or battered down. Inside the towers, the atmosphere during peaceful times would have been surprisingly comfortable. Thick walls provided excellent insulation, keeping the interior cool in summer and retaining heat in winter. The sound of daily life would echo through the stone chambers. The crackling of fires, quiet conversations, the soft footsteps of servants going about their duties. Many towers featured spiral staircases that wound their way up through the center of the structure. These staircases were marvels of engineering, with each step carefully cut to exactly the right dimension. Climbing these stairs was like ascending through history itself. each floor revealing different aspects of medieval life, from storage areas filled with barrels and sacks, to comfortable living quarters with tapestries on the walls and books on wooden lectern. The windows in castle towers were designed to serve multiple purposes. They provided light and ventilation, but they were also defensive features. The thick walls allowed for deep window embrasures, recessed areas where archers could position themselves to shoot out while remaining protected from return fire. During times of siege, towers became the backbone of the castle's defense. Each tower could operate independently, with its own supply of weapons, food and water. Even if attackers managed to breach the main walls, they would still face the daunting task of taking each tower individually, a process that could take weeks or even months. The weapons used to defend medieval castles were as varied and sophisticated as the fortifications themselves. Castle armories were filled with an impressive array of tools designed for different types of combat and defensive situations. The most common weapon for castle defense was the crossbow. These mechanical bows were perfect for castle warfare because they could be loaded and aimed more easily than traditional longbows in the confined spaces of towers and wall walks. A crossbow bolt could penetrate chainmail at close range, and the weapon could be used effectively by soldiers with relatively little training. Castle workshops would produce crossbow bolts by the thousands during times of preparation for siege. The process was almost meditative. Craftsmen would carefully select straight pieces of wood for the shafts, attach iron points forged in the castle's smithy, and add fletching made from goose or swan feathers. Barrels full of these bolts would be stored in towers and along the walls ready for use. Longbows were also used in castle defense, though they required much more skill and space to use effectively. A skilled archer could shoot 12 arrows per minute, and the range of a medieval longbow was impressive, up to 300 yards for accurate shooting. The sound of arrows being released from the castle walls would have been distinctive, a sharp twang followed by the whistle of the arrow in flight. For close combat, castle defenders relied on a variety of hand weapons. Swords were prestigious weapons, but they were actually less common than simpler tools like axes, maces, and polearms. A castle's armory would typically contain dozens of bills, agricultural tools modified for warfare, with long wooden handles and curved metal blades. The most fearsome defensive weapons were the large siege engines positioned on castle walls and towers. Trebuchets were massive catapults that used counterweights to hurl heavy stones at attacking forces. The largest trebuchets could throw stones weighing 300 pounds or more over distances of several hundred yards. The construction and operation of these machines was a specialized skill, requiring teams of engineers and operators. But perhaps the most psychologically effective defensive weapons were the simpler ones: cauldrons of boiling water or oil that could be poured down on attackers, heavy stones that could be dropped from murder holes, and containers of quicklime that would burn exposed skin and blind attackers. The process of preparing these defensive materials was a constant activity during times of tension. Castle kitchens would keep large cauldrons of water simmering over fires, ready to be heated to boiling at a moment's notice. Oil was more expensive and therefore used more sparingly, but it was devastatingly effective because it stuck to clothing and armor. Castle defenders also used more sophisticated projectiles. Greek fire, an early form of incendiary weapon, could be thrown in clay pots that would shatter on impact, spreading burning liquid over a wide area. The exact composition of Greek fire was a closely guarded secret, but it likely contained ingredients like pitch, sulfur, and salt. For defense against siege towers and other large wooden siege engines, castle defenders prepared fire arrows, regular arrows wrapped with cloth, soaked in pitch or oil, and set alight before shooting. These weren't as accurate, regular arrows, but they were highly effective at setting fire to wooden structures. The sound of weapons being prepared for battle would have been constant in a castle under threat. The rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths repairing armor and weapons, the scrape of whetstones against sword blades, the creak of crossbow strings being tested for tension. These sounds would mix with the more peaceful sounds of daily life: cooking, conversation, children playing in the inner courtyards. Castle defenders also used psychological warfare banners, and flags flying from the towers served not just to identify the castle's allegiance, but to project an image of strength and defiance. Musicians might play from the walls during a siege, demonstrating that morale remained high despite the enemy presence. The organization of weapons within the castle was carefully planned. Each tower and wall section would have its own supply of arrows, crossbow bolts and stones for throwing. Larger weapons like catapults and ballistae were positioned at strategic points where they could cover the most likely approaches. During peacetime, the maintenance of weapons was an ongoing responsibility. Swords and arrow points had to be kept sharp and free of rust. Crossbow strings needed to be replaced regularly. The wooden parts of weapons required treatment with oils to prevent cracking and warping. The castle's master-at-arms was responsible for training the garrison in the use of these weapons. Regular practice sessions would be held in the courtyards, with the sounds of sword against sword, the thunk of arrows hitting practice targets, and the instructions of sergeants training younger soldiers in proper techniques. When a medieval castle came under siege, life within its walls transformed dramatically. The bustling, relatively peaceful routine of normal times gave way to a carefully organized system of survival and defense that could continue for months. The first sign of an approaching siege would often come from the castle's lookouts, stationed in the highest towers with the best views of the surrounding countryside. These men had trained eyes that could spot the dust clouds raised by marching armies from many miles away. The cry of enemy approaching would echo through the castle, setting in motion a well-rehearsed series of preparations. One of the most critical aspects of siege preparation was securing adequate food and water supplies. Medieval castles were designed with this in mind. Most had their own wells dug deep into the bedrock, ensuring a supply of fresh water that couldn't be cut off by besiegers. The sound of the bucket being lowered into the well shaft, the splash as it hit water far below, and the creak of the windlass hauling it back up would become familiar sounds during a siege. Food storage was equally important. Castle storerooms would be packed with barrels of salted meat, wheels of hard cheese, sacks of grain, and other non-perishable items. During siege preparations, every available container would be filled with supply. Livestock from the surrounding area would be driven into the castle's outer courtyards, providing fresh meat for as long as possible. The process of rationing food during a siege was a delicate balance. The castle's steward, responsible for managing supplies, had to calculate how long the food would last based on the number of people in the castle and the expected duration of the siege. Meals became simpler and smaller, but maintaining adequate nutrition was crucial for keeping defenders strong enough to fight. Life during a siege followed a strict routine. Day would begin before dawn with the changing of the guard. Fresh sentries would take their positions on the walls while the night watch reported any observations from the darkness. The sound of boots on stone stairs, quiet words of greeting, and the jingle of mail armor would mark these transitions. During daylight hours, everyone in the castle had specific responsibilities. Men capable of fighting would take turns on guard duty, maintaining weapons, and participating in any active defense that was needed. Women would help with food preparation, caring for the wounded, and maintaining the household functions that kept the castle running. Children during a siege lived in a strange world where normal rules were suspended. They couldn't play outside the walls, so the courtyards became their entire universe. Their games often mimicked the adult activities around them, playing at being soldiers, practicing with wooden swords, or helping with simple tasks like carrying messages between different parts of the castle. The nights during a siege were perhaps the most challenging times. Attackers often chose darkness for their most serious assault attempts, so the entire castle had to remain alert throughout the night hours. Guards would walk their routes by torchlight, their footsteps echoing off the stone wall. The flame of torches would flicker in the wind, casting dancing shadows that could make every corner seem to hide a potential threat. Sleep during a siege was light and interrupted. Everyone knew that an attack could come at any moment, so even those not on active guard duty would sleep with their weapons close at hand. The sound of a horn or bell calling defenders to the walls could come at any hour, and everyone had to be ready to respond immediately. Medical care during sieges was primitive but crucial. Castle chapels often served as makeshift hospitals, with injured defenders laid on straw mattresses, while the castle's physician, often a monk with medical training, did what he could with limited supplies. The herbs growing in the castle's garden became precious resources for treating wounds and infections. One of the most psychologically challenging aspects of siege life was the uncertainty. No one knew how long the siege would last, whether relief forces would arrive, or if the castle's defenses would ultimately hold. This uncertainty created a particular kind of stress that affected everyone from the lord of the castle to the youngest server. Communication with the outside world during a siege was extremely difficult, but not impossible. Messages could sometimes be smuggled out by trusted individuals who knew secret passages or could slip through enemy lines under cover of dark. Carrier pigeons were occasionally used, though this was not as common as popular culture suggests. The besieging army would sometimes attempt to demoralize the castle's defenders through psychological warfare. They might display captured banners, make loud noises at night to prevent sleep, or call out threats and demands for surrender. The castle's defenders would respond with their own displays of defiance, flying banners from the highest towers, playing music, or calling back challenges. Religious observance took on special importance during sieges. Daily prayers became more frequent and fervent, with the castle's chaplain leading services that asked for divine protection and strength. The sound of Latin prayers echoing in the stone chapel would provide comfort and hope during the darkest moments of a siege. As a siege wore on, the social divisions within the castle sometimes began to blur. Noble lords might find themselves working alongside common soldiers in the defense of the walls. Shared danger and hardship created bonds between people who might normally have little contact with each other. The end of a siege, whether through successful defense, relief by friendly forces, or negotiated surrender, would bring an enormous sense of relief, mixed with exhaustion. The sounds of everyday life would gradually return, children laughing, normal conversations resuming, the routine activities of daily castle life slowly replacing the constant alertness of siege defense. The medieval period saw an arms race between the builders of siege engines and the defenders of castles. This constant competition drove innovation on both sides, resulting in increasingly sophisticated machines of war and equally clever countermeasures. Trebuchets were among the most feared siege weapons of the medieval period. These massive machines used the principle of the counterweight to hurl heavy projectiles over great distances. The largest trebuchets could throw stones weighing several hundred pounds, and their range could exceed 300 yards. The construction of a trebuchet was a major undertaking that required skilled engineers and substantial resources. The sound of a trebuchet in operation was distinctive and terrifying. The creaking of wood under enormous stress, the whoosh of the throwing arm as it swung through its arc, and the crash of the projectile hitting its target would echo across the battlefield. For defenders inside a castle, the whistle of an incoming stone followed by the crash of impact on their walls became a constant source of anxiety. Castle defenders developed several strategies for dealing with trebuchets. The most direct approach was to build their own siege engines on the castle walls and attempt to destroy the attacking machines before they could do too much damage. This led to artillery duels that could last for days, with both sides hurling stones at each other across the battlefield. Another defensive strategy was to build walls thick enough to absorb the impact of trebuchet stones without suffering critical damage. The development of massive thick walls in later medieval castles was partly a response to the increasing power of siege engines. These walls could absorb tremendous punishment while still maintaining their structural integrity. Mangonels were smaller siege engines that used twisted rope or sinew to provide the power for launching projectiles. While they couldn't throw stones as heavy as trebuchets, they were more mobile and could be built more quickly. They were particularly effective for throwing incendiary projectiles, burning pitch, Greek fire, or even dead animals intended to spread disease within the castle. The process of building siege engines was fascinating to observe. Master carpenters would work with teams of assistants to cut and shape the massive timbers needed for the frame. Rope makers would twist together the strong cords needed for torsion engines. Blacksmiths would forge the metal fittings that held everything together. The entire process could take weeks, during which time the defending castle would watch nervously as the machines took shape. Battering rams were perhaps the most straightforward siege weapons, but they were also among the most effective against gates and walls. The largest battering rams were enormous logs, sometimes 60 feet long or more, suspended from wheeled frames and operated by teams of dozens of men. The rhythmic pounding of a battering ram against a castle gate would create a sound that could be heard for miles, a deep, booming percussion that would continue for hours. Castle defenders had several ways to deal with battering rams. They could drop heavy stones or pour boiling liquids on the operators. They could use long hooks to try to catch and deflect the ram. Some castle gates were designed with multiple barriers, so that even if the first gate was breached, attackers would still face additional obstacles. Siege towers were mobile structures that allowed attackers to bring large numbers of men up to the height of castle walls. These towers were essentially wooden castles on wheels, with multiple floors connected by internal ladders or ramp. The largest siege towers could be 100 feet tall or more, making them taller than most castle walls. The construction of a siege tower was an impressive undertaking. Carpenters would build the frame from heavy timbers, while other craftsmen would add floors, walls, and protective coverings. The tower would often be covered with wet hides or metal plates to protect it from fire arrows. Moving such a massive structure across rough ground required careful planning and tremendous effort. Castle defenders developed specific techniques for dealing with siege towers. They would try to set them on fire using incendiary arrows or Greek fire. They would attempt to undermine the ground in front of their walls to create obstacles. Some castles had special defensive engines designed specifically to destroy siege towers, giant crossbows called ballistae that could shoot heavy bolts capable of penetrating the tower's protective covering. The use of undermining, digging tunnels under castle walls to cause them to collapse led to a fascinating underground war during many sieges. Attackers would dig careful tunnels, shoring them up with wooden supports as they went. When they reached the foundation of a wall, they would pack the tunnel with combustible materials and set it on fire, causing the supports to burn away and the tunnel to collapse, hopefully bringing down the wall above. Castle defenders would countermine, dig their own tunnels to intercept the attackers' tunnels. When the two tunnels met, fierce underground battles would take place in the narrow, dark passages. These fights were particularly dangerous because of the risk of tunnel collapse and the difficulty of maneuvering in such confined spaces. The sound of tunneling was often the first sign of an undermining attempt. Defenders would place bowls of water along their walls and watch for ripples that might indicate digging below. They would also listen carefully for the sounds of picks and shovels working in the earth beneath their foundation. Greek fire and other incendiary weapons represented some of the most advanced military technology of the medieval period. The exact composition of Greek fire was a closely guarded secret, but it was probably based on petroleum products mixed with other chemicals that made it burn fiercely and resist water. The psychological effect of these weapons was often as important as their physical damage. The preparation and use of incendiary weapons required special skills and equipment. Castle defenders would maintain stocks of the necessary materials and have trained specialists who knew how to prepare and deploy these weapons safely. The process of making Greek fire was dangerous, as the materials were highly flammable and could explode if mishandled. The success or failure of a castle's defense often depended less on the strength of its fortifications than on the courage, skill, and determination of the men and women who lived within its walls. A castle's garrison was typically composed of several different types of people, each with their own roles and responsibilities. At the top of the hierarchy was the castle's lord or his appointed constable, the person ultimately responsible for the defense of the fortress. These leaders had to be skilled not just in military tactics, but in managing people, supplies, and the complex logistics of castle life. Professional soldiers formed the core of most castle garrisons. These men-at-arms were career warriors who had trained from youth in the arts of combat. They were skilled with multiple weapons, experienced in siege warfare, and familiar with the specific defensive features of their castle. During peacetime, they would spend their days training, maintaining equipment, and standing guard duty. The daily routine of professional soldiers in a castle was surprisingly structured and disciplined. They would rise before dawn for morning prayers, then begin their duties with the changing of the guard. Throughout the day, they would take turns at different posts, some walking the walls, others manning the gatehouse, still others training in the courtyards or maintaining their equipment. Training was a constant activity for castle garrison. Soldiers would practice with swords, axes and polearms in the courtyards, the sound of wooden practice weapons clacking together echoing off the stone walls. Archery practice would take place in designated areas, with targets set up at various distances to simulate combat conditions. Beyond the professional soldiers, most castle garrisons included a significant number of part-time fighters, local farmers, craftsmen, and villagers who had sworn to serve the castle's lord in times of need. These men might not have the polish of professional warriors, but they often fought with fierce determination to protect their homes and families. The relationship between professional soldiers and local militia was crucial to castle defense. The experienced warriors would teach combat skills to the newcomers, showing them how to use weapons effectively and how to work together as a team. During quiet evening hours, you might hear the patient voice of a grizzled sergeant explaining the proper way to hold a spear, or the best technique for shooting a crossbow. Women played vital roles in castle defense, though their contributions are often overlooked in traditional accounts. They served as nurses and medics, treating wounded defenders with herbal remedies and basic surgical techniques. They helped maintain the castle's food supplies, prepared meals for large numbers of people, and managed the complex household logistics that kept the fortress functioning. During sieges, women often took direct roles in combat. They would carry arrows and stones to defenders on the walls, help operate siege engines, and sometimes even fight directly when the situation became desperate. Contemporary accounts describe women pouring boiling water on attackers, shooting crossbows from the walls, and helping to repair damaged fortifications. Children in castle garrisons lived in a unique environment, where they were exposed to military life from an early age. Boys would begin training with weapons as soon as they were old enough to hold them, starting with wooden swords and progressing to real weapons as they grew older. Girls would learn the skills needed to support castle operations, cooking, healing, and managing supply. The sound of children at play in castle courtyards would mix with the more serious sounds of military preparation. Their laughter and games provided a reminder of what the defenders were fighting to protect, and their presence helped maintain morale during difficult times. Morale was perhaps the most critical factor in castle defense. A garrison that believed in their cause and trusted their leaders could hold out against overwhelming odds, while a demoralized force might surrender even from a strong position. Castle commanders spent considerable effort maintaining their troops' spirits through various means. Religious services played an important role in maintaining morale. The castle's chaplain would hold regular masses in the chapel, offering prayers for the safety of the defenders and the success of their cause. The sound of Latin chants echoing through the stone chapel would provide comfort and spiritual strength to the men facing the possibility of death in battle. Music was another important element in castle life. Professional musicians were often part of the household, providing entertainment during meals and special occasions. During sieges, music could serve as a form of psychological warfare, playing lively tunes from the walls to show that morale remained high, or to drown out the taunts and threats of besieging enemies. The sharing of meals was a crucial social activity that helped bind the garrison together. In the Great Hall, long wooden tables would be set up where soldiers, servants, and family members would eat together. The sound of conversation, laughter, and the clink of wooden bowls and metal cups created a sense of community and shared purpose. Stories and tales were another important element of garrison life. During long winter evenings or tense periods of siege, experienced soldiers would share stories of past battles, heroic deeds, and legendary warriors. These tales served not just as entertainment, but as a way of passing down military knowledge and inspiring courage in younger fighters. The castle smith was a crucial member of the community, responsible for maintaining weapons and armor, shoeing horses, and creating the iron tools needed for daily life. The rhythmic hammering from the smithy would be a constant background sound, punctuated by the hiss of hot metal being quenched in water and the wheeze of bellows feeding the forge fires. Both attackers and defenders understood that psychological pressure could be just as effective as catapults and battering rams in determining the outcome of a siege. Besieging armies often began their psychological campaigns before any physical attack commenced. They would establish their camps within sight of the castle walls, deliberately displaying their numbers and equipment to intimidate the defenders. The sight of hundreds or thousands of enemy soldiers setting up pavilions and siege engines would send a clear message about the strength of the attacking force. The process of establishing a siege camp was itself a form of psychological warfare. Attackers would take their time, methodically surrounding the castle and cutting off all routes of escape or resupply. The sound of axes cutting wood for siege engines, hammers building fortifications, and the general bustle of a large army at work would carry clearly to the defenders on the wall. Attackers often used displays of captured banners and equipment to demoralize castle garrisons. If they had defeated other forces before arriving at the castle, they would prominently display the banners and weapons they had captured, showing the defenders the fate that had befallen their ally. These grim trophies were powerful psychological weapons that could undermine confidence and hope. The use of trumpets and drums was another common psychological tactic. Besieging armies would sometimes maintain constant noise throughout the night, preventing the defenders from sleeping and wearing down their morale through exhaustion. The sound of war drums beating in the darkness, horns blowing at irregular intervals, and the shouts and songs of enemy soldiers could create an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Defenders had their own arsenal of psychological weapons. They would fly their banners prominently from the highest towers, demonstrating that they remained defiant and unconquered. The sight of colourful heraldic banners snapping in the wind above the battlements served as a symbol of resistance and determination. Castle defenders often responded to enemy psychological warfare with displays of their own confidence and strength. They might organize musical performances on the walls, with trumpeters and drummers playing lively tunes that could be heard throughout the enemy camp. These performances served multiple purposes. They boosted the morale of the defenders, demonstrated that they had adequate supplies and energy for such activities, and showed contempt for the besieging force. The practice of parley, formal negotiations between attackers and defenders, was an important part of medieval siege warfare. These meetings would typically take place in neutral ground between the castle and the siege lines, with representatives from both sides meeting under flags of truce. The sound of a single trumpet calling for parley would echo across the battlefield, bringing a temporary halt to hostilities. During these negotiations, both sides would engage in elaborate verbal sparring, with each trying to convince the other of the hopelessness of their position. Attackers would describe the overwhelming force at their disposal and the inevitable fate of those who resisted. Defenders would point to the strength of their fortifications and their determination to fight to the last man. The timing and frequency of assault attempts was often calculated for psychological effect. Attackers might launch small probing attacks at irregular intervals, keeping the defenders constantly on edge and preventing them from establishing any sense of routine or safety. The uncertainty of when the next attack might come could be as wearing as the attacks themselves. Some besieging forces would attempt to corrupt the defenders through bribery or promises of safe passage. They would try to identify key individuals within the castle who might be persuaded to betray their comrades in exchange for gold or guarantees of personal safety. The knowledge that such efforts were underway could create suspicion and distrust within the garrison. Defenders sometimes used elaborate ruses to convince attackers that they had more supplies or men than they actually possessed. They might march the same soldiers past windows multiple times to create the illusion of a larger garrison, or light more cooking fires than necessary to suggest abundant food supplies. These deceptions required careful coordination and could be highly effective if executed properly. The use of religious symbols and appeals was common on both sides. Attackers might claim that God favored their cause and that resistance was therefore sinful. Defenders would respond with their own religious displays, holding public prayers on the walls and invoking divine protection for their cause. The sound of hymns and prayers rising from castle courtyards served both spiritual and psychological purpose. Weather conditions could significantly affect the psychological aspects of siege warfare. A long, cold winter could wear down the morale of both attackers and defenders, but it often favored those inside the castle who had better shelter and more secure supply lines. The sound of wind howling through siege camps, and the discomfort of sleeping in the open during storms, could make besieging armies eager to conclude their campaign quickly. The arrival of relief forces, or even rumors of approaching allies, could dramatically alter the psychological balance of a siege. The sound of distant horns or the sight of banners on the horizon could either boost the defenders' morale or cause panic among the attackers, depending on whose forces were approaching. Medieval castle architects were masters of psychological manipulation, designing their fortresses not just to be physically impregnable, but to strike fear and uncertainty into the hearts of potential attackers. Every element of a castle's design was carefully considered for its effect on both defenders and enemies. The approach to a medieval castle was deliberately designed to be intimidating and confusing. Rather than providing a direct path to the main gate, castle approaches typically involved winding roads that forced visitors to travel slowly while remaining exposed to observation and potential attack from the walls above. These serpentine paths would take visitors past multiple defensive positions, each one a reminder of the castle's strength. The visual impact of a castle was carefully calculated to project power and invincibility. The massive walls rising from cliff tops or hilltops could be seen from miles away, dominating the landscape and serving as a constant reminder of the Lord's authority. The sheer scale of these structures was designed to make potential enemies think twice about challenging such formidable defense. Castle gatehouses were particularly designed to intimidate visitors. The entrance passage was typically long, narrow, and dark, with multiple gates and portcullises blocking the way. As visitors passed through these confined spaces, they would be acutely aware of their vulnerability. Murder holes above their heads, arrow slits in the walls beside them, and the knowledge that they were completely at the mercy of the defender. The sound effects within castle gatehouses added to their intimidating atmosphere. Footsteps would echo off stone walls, voices would be amplified and distorted by the narrow passages, and the creak of gate hinges or the rattle of chains would remind visitors that they were entering a heavily defended military installation. Many castles featured bent entrances that forced visitors to make sharp turns while passing through the gatehouse. This design served practical defensive purposes, but it also had a psychological effect. Visitors could never see what lay ahead, creating a sense of uncertainty and vulnerability that reinforced the castle's power. The interiors of castle keeps were designed to impress and intimidate visitors as much as the exterior walls. Great halls were built on a massive scale, with soaring ceilings and enormous fireplaces that demonstrated the wealth and power of the castle's lord. The sound of footsteps on stone floors, voices echoing in vast spaces, and the crackle of huge fires created an atmosphere of grandeur and authority. Windows in castle keeps were positioned and sized to create specific psychological effects. The lower floors had small, narrow windows that created a sense of security and protection for those inside, while making the building appear fortress-like from the outside. Upper floors had larger windows that allowed the lord's family to observe the surrounding countryside, while demonstrating their elevated status. The use of height in castle design was a deliberate psychological tactic. Towers were built as tall as the technology and budget of the time allowed, not just for practical defensive reasons, but to project an image of power that could be seen from great distances. The effort required to climb the many flights of stairs to reach the upper chambers of a keep would leave visitors breathless and reminded them of the castle lord's elevated position. Castle courtyards were designed to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate the complexity of the fortress. Visitors would pass through multiple courtyards, each one more exclusive than the last, gradually working their way toward the inner sanctum, where the lord resided. This progression reinforced the idea that the castle was a complete self-contained world, with its own rules and power structure. The placement of defensive features was calculated to be visible to potential attackers, while remaining functionally effective for defenders. Arrow slits were positioned where they could be easily seen from outside the walls, serving as a reminder that the castle was always prepared for attack. The sight of these dark openings in the walls would make any potential attacker aware that they were being watched and targeted. Defensive walkways along the tops of walls were designed to allow defenders to move quickly and safely while remaining visible to enemies below. The sight of armed guards patrolling the battlements reinforced the message that the castle was actively defended and ready for trouble. The sound of armored footsteps on stone walkways and the occasional call of sentries would carry to anyone approaching the fortress. Castle architects also used the natural landscape to enhance the psychological impact of their fortifications. Castles built on high ground not only gained defensive advantages, but also appeared larger and more imposing when viewed from below. The sight of massive walls rising from cliff tops or rocky outcrops created an impression of impregnability that was often more powerful than the actual defensive capabilities. The integration of religious elements into castle design served both spiritual and psychological purposes. Castle chapels were often prominently positioned where they could be seen from outside the walls, demonstrating that the castle's defenders enjoyed divine protection. The sound of church bells ringing from castle towers would carry across the countryside, marking the passage of time and reminding everyone within hearing that the castle remained unconquered. Water features around castles served psychological as well as practical purposes. The sight and sound of water in moats created an impression of luxury and permanence, suggesting that the castle's lords had the resources to maintain such elaborate defenses. The reflection of castle walls in still water could make the fortress appear even larger and more impressive than it actually was. The maintenance and appearance of castle defenses was carefully managed to project an image of strength and prosperity. Walls were kept in good repair, banners were regularly replaced to ensure they remained bright and impressive, and defensive equipment was maintained in visible readiness. Any sign of neglect or decay could suggest weakness and encourage potential attackers. Therefore, medieval castles were never truly silent. Even during the quietest hours of the night, these great fortresses hummed with the subtle sounds of life, security, and daily routine. Understanding these sounds helps us appreciate the complex rhythm of medieval castle life and the constant state of readiness that characterized these military installations. The day in a medieval castle began long before dawn, with the sound of the chapel bell calling the faithful to morning prayers. This bell, usually cast in bronze and mounted in the castle's chapel tower, would ring out across the courtyards and surrounding countryside, its deep, resonant tone marking the beginning of another day. The sound would echo off the stone walls, creating a complex pattern of reverberations that gradually faded into silence. Following the chapel bell, the sounds of the changing guard would ripple through the castle. The soft jingle of mail armor, the creak of leather, and the muffled conversations of soldiers taking over from the night watch would gradually spread from tower to tower as fresh sentries assumed their posts. The retiring guards would make their way down stone staircases, their footsteps creating a gentle rhythm that spoke of routine and discipline. As the sky began to lighten, the sounds of daily life would slowly emerge from the various buildings within the castle walls. Kitchen fires would be kindled, creating the soft crackling and popping of burning wood. The bellows in the smithy would begin their rhythmic wheeze as the blacksmith prepared his forge for the day's work. Stable hands would begin tending to the horses, their voices mixing with the gentle whickering and stamping of the animals. The great hall would come alive with the sounds of breakfast preparation. Wooden bowls and cups would be placed on long tables, creating gentle knocking sounds as they were arranged for the morning meal. Servants would hurry back and forth, their soft-soled shoes making whisper-quiet sounds on the stone floor. The kitchen would buzz with activity as cooks prepared porridge, bread and ale for the castle's inhabitants. Throughout the morning hours, the castle would fill with the sounds of work and daily routine. The steady rhythm of hammering would come from the smithy as weapons were repaired and horseshoes were shaped. The scrape of whetstones against metal would indicate that blades were being sharpened. From the stables would come the sound of currycombs working through horses' coats, and the gentle words of grooms calming their charges. Training activities would add their own distinctive sounds to the castle's daily symphony. In the courtyards, the wooden clack of practice swords meeting shields would create a staccato rhythm. Archery practice would be marked by the distinctive twang of bowstrings and the solid thunk of arrows hitting straw target. Instructors would call out corrections and encouragement, their voices echoing off the surrounding walls. The noon meal would bring a temporary lull in most activities, as the castle's inhabitants gathered in the great hall. The sound of conversation would fill the large space, creating a warm buzz of human interaction. Wooden spoons would scrape against bowls, and the occasional laugh or raised voice would punctuate the general murmur of mealtime discussion. Afternoon activities would resume with their own characteristic sounds. Craftsmen in their workshops would continue their specialized work. The tap-tap-tap of a stonecutter's chisel, the rhythmic scraping of a carpenter's plane, the soft hiss of leather being worked by the castle's cobbler. Women would gather in sunny courtyards for spinning and weaving, their work accompanied by quiet conversation and occasional songs. The castle's administrative functions would add more subtle sounds to the daily mix. In the Lord's chambers, the scratch of quill pens on parchment would mark the recording of accounts, the drafting of letters, and the maintenance of the various records necessary for running a medieval estate. The soft voice of a clerk reading aloud and the gentle rustle of document rolls being moved would indicate the ongoing business of governance. As evening approached, the sounds would gradually shift toward the quieter activities of night. The chapel bell would ring again for evening prayers, its tone now taking on a more contemplative quality in the gathering dusk. Kitchen activities would intensify as the main meal of the day was prepared, with the clatter of pots and the sizzle of meat over fires creating a backdrop of domestic activity. The great hall would come alive for the evening meal, the most social time of the castle day. Conversation would be louder and more animated, often accompanied by music from professional entertainers or castle residents with musical skills. The sound of lutes, flutes, and drums would mix with singing voices, creating an atmosphere of celebration and community. As night fell, the sounds would gradually diminish to the essential noises of security and vigilance. Guards would walk their rounds, their footsteps marking regular intervals as they passed from post to post. The occasional call of "All's well" would echo across the courtyards as sentries confirmed that their sections remained secure. Torches would crackle in their brackets, creating a steady background sound of burning wood and occasionally popping as pockets of resin ignited. The night hours would be marked by the subtle sounds of a fortress at rest, but still alert. The distant hoot of owls from the surrounding countryside, the rustle of small animals in the thatch of outbuildings, and the gentle sighing of wind through stone passages would create a peaceful but watchful atmosphere. Occasionally, the sound of a baby crying or a brief conversation between guards would remind listeners that the castle remained inhabited and defended throughout the dark hours. Even the silence of a medieval castle had its own quality, not the empty quiet of an abandoned place, but the expectant hush of a community at rest, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. This quality of readiness permeated every sound and every silence within the castle wall. The rhythm of life in a medieval castle was deeply influenced by the changing seasons, each bringing its own challenges, activities, and atmospheric quality. Castle inhabitants lived much closer to the natural world than modern people, and their daily routines shifted dramatically with the weather and the time of year. Winter was perhaps the most challenging season for castle life. The thick stone walls that provided such excellent protection against enemies also created spaces that were difficult to heat effectively. Even with large fireplaces in the main rooms, much of a castle remained cold and damp during the winter months. The sound of wind whistling through arrow slits and around towers would be a constant companion throughout the cold season. The acoustic environment of a winter castle was uniquely atmospheric. Stone walls, already excellent conductors of sound, would become even more resonant in the cold, dry air. Conversations in one part of the castle could often be heard echoing faintly through corridors and chambers, creating an almost ghostly quality to daily interaction. The click of wooden shoes on frost-covered stones would ring out clearly in the crisp air, while the rustle of heavy woolen clothing became a constant whisper as people moved about their daily tasks. Preparing for winter was a major undertaking that began in late summer. The sounds of this preparation would fill the castle courtyards, the thud of axes splitting firewood, the scrape of tools preparing root cellars for storage, and the bustle of activity as livestock were moved to winter quarters. Servants would work to seal windows with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, creating temporary barriers against the cold while still allowing some light to enter. The winter preparation sounds created their own seasonal symphony. Carpenters would work long hours crafting and repairing shutters, their hammers creating rhythmic percussion against the backdrop of daily castle life. The scraping of mortar and stone as workers sealed gaps in walls would add texture to this preparation chorus. Blacksmiths would work overtime, their forges burning bright and hot, creating the tools and implements needed for winter survival, fire tongs, grates, and the countless nails and fixtures required for winter modifications. Storage activities dominated the autumn to winter transition. The hollow thump of barrels being rolled across cobblestones would echo through courtyards as preserved foods were moved to storage areas. Grain being poured into storage containers created cascading sounds like gentle rainfall, while the process of salting meat produced the distinctive scraping and grinding sounds of coarse salt being worked into provision. The great fireplaces in castle halls would become the centers of winter social life. These massive structures, often large enough for several people to stand inside, would consume enormous quantities of wood throughout the cold month. The sound of logs being split and stacked would be constant, and the distinctive crack and pop of burning hardwood would provide a comforting background to winter evening conversations. Each type of wood produced its own characteristic sounds when burned. Oak would crackle steadily with occasional sharp pops, while pine would hiss and spit as its resin heated. Birch bark would curl and whisper as it caught fire, and the dense hardwoods like ash and beech would burn with a quiet intensity, occasionally shifting with soft thuds as they settled in the fireplace. The different woods also created distinct aromatic environments: the sweet scent of applewood, the sharp cleanliness of birch, and the rich earthy smell of oak burning. Winter storms could be particularly dramatic experiences in a castle setting. The sound of wind howling around the towers and walls would create an almost musical effect, with different architectural features producing different tones and harmonies. Rain or sleet would drum against shuttered windows and run in streams down the stone walls, creating the constant sound of water movement throughout the structure. The acoustic effects of winter storms on castle architecture were remarkable. Round towers would create deep organ-like tones as wind flowed around them, while square towers and straight walls would produce higher-pitched whistles and moans. Crenellations along the top of walls would create rapid, staccato sounds as wind rushed through the gaps, sometimes producing an almost musical rhythm. The combination of these various architectural wind instruments could create hauntingly beautiful natural symphonies during major storms. Snow would transform the castle's acoustic environment, muffling many sounds while amplifying others. Footsteps in snow-covered courtyards would create a soft crunching rhythm, while voices would carry differently in the cold, clear air. Icicles forming on castle towers would occasionally break free and crash to the ground, their impact echoing through the courtyards. The snow's effect on castle acoustics was profound and constantly changing. Fresh powder would absorb sound almost completely, creating an eerily quiet environment where whispered conversations could be heard clearly across courtyards. As snow aged and crusted, it would become more reflective, bouncing sounds in unexpected directions. The formation and melting of ice created its own soundscape. The gentle tinkle of forming icicles, the sharp crack of ice expanding in stone joints, and the steady drip-drop of melting that would begin even on the coldest days where sun touched south-facing walls. Winter brought unique challenges for castle defenders. Guards walking their rounds on wall-tops would have to contend with ice-slick stones and snow-filled crenellation. Their footsteps would have a different quality, more careful and deliberate, with the occasional scrape of a boot finding purchase on an icy stone. The sound of guards stamping their feet to maintain warmth became a regular rhythm throughout winter nights, while the rustle of thick cloaks and the clink of armor pieces contracting in the cold added to the winter defensive soundscape. The sounds of winter gradually gave way to the activities of renewal and preparation. Ice melting from castle roofs would create the constant drip and trickle of water running through gutters and downspouts. The first birds returning from their winter migrations would add their songs to the morning symphony of castle sounds. The transition from winter to spring created a daily symphony of change. As morning sun struck the castle walls, the first sounds would be the gentle dripping of melting frost and ice. This would gradually increase to a steady flow as the day warmed, with water running through stone channels and crude gutters, often overflowing and creating small waterfalls down the castle wall. The sound of this water was both promising and concerning. Promising because it meant winter was ending, but concerning because it could reveal structural weaknesses where water might penetrate the stone and cause damage. Spring cleaning was a major undertaking in medieval castles. Tapestries and wall hangings would be taken down and aired, creating the sound of fabric snapping in the breeze. Rushes that had covered floors throughout the winter would be swept out and replaced with fresh ones, often mixed with herbs and flowers that would add pleasant scents to the rooms, while helping to repel insects. The spring cleaning process created its own acoustic signature. The swish of brooms against stone floors would echo through empty chambers, while the flapping of tapestries being beaten clean would crack like whips in the courtyards. Windows being opened for the first time in months would creak on their hinges, often protesting with squeaks and groans after months of disuse. The scraping of accumulated soot from fireplaces would create clouds of black dust and produce harsh, gritty sounds as soot-hardened surfaces were cleaned. The replacement of floor rushes was a particularly significant sound event. Old rushes, compressed and often damp from months of use, would make soggy, matted sounds as they were raked up and removed. Fresh rushes would rustle with a bright, dry sound as they were spread, often mixed with herbs like lavender, rosemary and mint, that would release their fragrances when stepped upon. The process of gathering these herbs would begin weeks before the cleaning, with servants venturing into the surrounding countryside to collect the aromatic plants that would sweeten the castle's atmosphere. The castle's gardens would come alive in spring with the sounds of cultivation. Spades would scrape against stone as beds were prepared for planting. The voices of gardeners would mix with the sound of water being carried to newly planted seed. Herbs and vegetables essential for both cooking and medicine would be carefully tended, with the gentle sounds of watering and weeding creating a peaceful backdrop to other castle activities. Spring gardening created a complex soundscape of renewal. The chunk of spades breaking winter-hardened earth would ring against stone and root system. Water being poured from buckets onto thirsty soil would create different sounds depending on the soil's condition. Dry earth would absorb water with a whispered hiss, while waterlogged areas would squelch and bubble. The gentle rustle of emerging plants added subtle textures to the garden's acoustic environment, while the industrious sounds of earthworms and insects returning to active life created an underlying buzz of biological activity. Castle livestock would emerge from their winter quarters with their own spring sounds. Horses would whinny and stamp with renewed energy, their hooves creating sharper, more spirited rhythms on the cobblestones. Cattle would low with what seemed like relief at being able to graze fresh grass again, while chickens would create increased chatter and activity as laying resumed with longer daylight hours. The castle's cats, who had spent winter months mostly indoors near fireplaces, would begin their prowling again, their soft footsteps and occasional calls adding to the spring symphony. The sounds of construction and repair would intensify in spring. Winter damage would need to be assessed and repaired before the next harsh season. Masons would chip away at damaged stones, their tools creating sharp, precise sounds against the castle walls. Carpenters would work on wooden structures that had been damaged by ice and snow, with saws and hammers creating industrious rhythms. The mixing of mortar would add its own wet, grinding sounds, while the placement of new stones would echo through the courtyards with solid, permanent thud. Summer brought its own rhythms and challenges. The long days meant that castle activities could continue well into the evening hours, with work and social activities extending beyond the typical winter schedule. Windows could be left unshuttered, allowing the natural sounds of the countryside to drift into the castle courtyards. Bird songs, the buzz of insects, and the distant sounds of agricultural work in the surrounding field. The extended daylight of summer fundamentally changed the castle's daily rhythm. Work could continue productively until nearly sunset, which in midsummer might not occur until well after what would be considered normal bedtime in winter. This created a more relaxed, expansive feeling to castle life, with conversations and activities flowing more naturally into the evening hours. The sounds of daily work would extend correspondingly. The ring of blacksmith hammers, the scrape of stone being worked, and the general bustle of castle maintenance could continue well into what would have been quiet evening hours during winter months. The castle's wells and water sources required constant attention during hot weather. The sound of buckets being lowered into deep wells and the creak of windlass mechanisms would be frequent reminders of the constant need for fresh water. Cisterns and water storage areas would be carefully monitored to ensure adequate supplies for both people and animals. Water management became a critical and audibly prominent aspect of summer castle life. The creaking of well mechanisms would become almost constant during hot days, as the demand for fresh water increased dramatically. The splash of buckets hitting water at the bottom of deep wells would echo up through the stone-lined shafts, creating hollow, reverberating sound. Water being poured into storage vessels would create different tones depending on the container. The ring of metal buckets, the hollow sound of wooden barrels, and the smooth whisper of water flowing into stone cistern. The sounds of water consumption also increased, horses drinking deeply at troughs, with their loud rhythmic swallowing clearly audible in the courtyard. People washing themselves and their clothes would create splashing sounds in wash basins, while the wringing of wet cloth would add sharp twisting sounds to the daily acoustic landscape. Fountains, where they existed, would become focal points of summer castle life, their constant trickling providing both practical water access and pleasant background sounds that helped mask the heat of summer days. Summer storms could be spectacular events when viewed from castle towers. The approach of thunderstorms could be seen from miles away, with lightning illuminating the landscape and thunder echoing off the stone walls. The sound of heavy rain on stone surfaces would create a drumming rhythm throughout the castle, while gutters and drains would overflow with rushing water. Summer thunderstorms provided some of the most dramatic acoustic experiences in castle life. The approach of a storm could be heard long before it arrived, a distant rumbling that would gradually increase in intensity and frequency. As storms drew closer, the sound would separate into distinct thunderclaps, each one echoing and re-echoing off the various stone surfaces of the castle complex. Lightning strikes close to the castle would create sharp cracks followed by long rolling echoes that seemed to bounce between towers and walls for many seconds. The rain itself would create complex rhythmic patterns as it struck different surfaces. Stone would ring with sharp, percussive drops, while wood would produce duller, more muffled impacts. Thatch, where it existed on outbuildings, would hiss and whisper as rain soaked into the straw. Metal surfaces like armor, weapons and tools, left in courtyards would create clear bell-like tones as raindrops struck them. The combination of all these different surfaces being struck simultaneously by heavy rain would create a rich, complex percussion that could be both soothing and overwhelming. Castle courtyards would often flood slightly during heavy summer rains, creating temporary streams and pools that would add the sound of flowing and pooling water to the storm symphony. These temporary waterways would gurgle and splash as they found their way toward drains and low points, often creating miniature waterfalls as water cascaded down steps and terraces. The aftermath of summer storms brought its own acoustic signature. The steady drip of water from overhanging structures would continue for hours after the rain stopped. Puddles would reflect sounds differently, making footsteps splash and voices carry in new ways. The air would smell fresh and clean, and often the first sounds to return would be birds emerging from their storm shelters, tentatively beginning to sing again as the weather cleared. The sounds of agricultural activity would drift in from the surrounding countryside, the rhythm of scythes cutting grain, the creak of cartwheels bringing in the harvest, and the voices of workers celebrating successful crops. Castle courtyards would be filled with the sounds of food preservation activities, the chopping of vegetables for storage, the preparation of meat for salting, and the pressing of grapes or apples for wine and cider. Autumn was the season when the castle's connection to the surrounding agricultural community became most apparent through sound. The distant rhythm of harvest work would create a constant background throughout the day, the swish of scythes through grain, the thud of flails beating grain from stalks, and the calls of workers coordinating their efforts across the field. As the harvest was brought to the castle, the sounds would become more immediate and intense. Cartwheels creaking under heavy loads would announce the arrival of each harvest load long before the carts came into view. The sound of wooden wheels on stone cobblestones would create a distinctive rumbling that would echo through the castle gatehouse and into the courtyards. Oxen and horses pulling these heavy loads would strain against their harnesses, their breathing and occasional lowing adding to the harvest symphony. The voices of cart drivers encouraging their animals and coordinating the complex process of bringing loads through narrow castle gates would add human elements to these arrival sounds. Once harvest materials reached the castle courtyards, the processing sounds would begin in earnest. Grain being poured from carts into storage areas would create cascading, rushing sounds as thousands of individual kernels flowed together. The separation of grain from chaff would add the whispered sound of winnowing, as workers used baskets and fans to blow away the lighter chaff, while allowing the heavier grain to fall into collection vessels. The autumn hunting season would add its own distinctive sounds to castle life. The baying of hunting hounds, the sound of horse hooves on cobblestones as hunting parties prepared to depart, and the blast of hunting horns would mark these expeditions. Returning hunters would bring their own sounds, the clatter of weapons and equipment being cleaned and stored, and the activities of processing game animals for the castle's winter food supply. Hunting sounds began well before dawn on hunting days, as handlers prepared the hounds and horses for the day's expedition. Dogs would be fed and excited, creating a complex chorus of barks, whines, and yelps as they anticipated the hunt. Horses would whinny and stamp, their iron shoes creating sharp strikes against the cobblestones. The preparation of hunting equipment would add metallic sounds, the ring of swords being checked in their sheaths, the creak of leather as saddles and harnesses were adjusted, and the distinctive sound of arrows being counted and arranged in quivers. The departure of a hunting party would create a crescendo of sound that would gradually fade as the hunters moved away from the castle. Hunting horns would sound the departure, their clear carrying notes echoing off the castle walls and announcing to the surrounding countryside that the hunt was beginning. The rhythm of multiple horses leaving at once would create a thunderous drumming on the cobblestones that would slowly fade to silence as the party moved into the surrounding country. The return of successful hunting parties would be announced by horn calls that would carry across miles of countryside, letting the castle know that the hunters were returning and how successful they had been. Different horn calls would indicate different types of success, whether large game had been taken, the size of the hunting party returning, and whether any accidents or injuries had occurred during the hunt. The processing of game animals would add its own intensive sounds to autumn castle life. The butchering of large animals like deer, wild boar, and occasionally bears would require significant coordination and skill. The sounds of this process, the sharpening of knives and cleavers, the cutting and chopping of meat, and the preparation of hides for tanning, would occupy entire sections of the castle for days after successful hunts. Food preservation activities would intensify throughout autumn, creating distinctive seasonal soundscapes. The chopping of vegetables for drying and storage would create rhythmic percussion as knives struck cutting boards repeatedly. Root vegetables being cleaned would scrape against stone surfaces as dirt was removed. The process of salting meat would create distinctive grinding sounds as coarse salt was worked into flesh, while the preparation of sausages would add the sound of meat being ground and mixed with spice. Apple and grape pressing would create some of autumn's most pleasant sounds. The crushing of apples in cider presses would produce wet, pulping sounds, while the extraction of juice would create flowing, liquid sounds as the pressed cider ran into collection vessels. Winemaking would add the sounds of grape crushing, either by feet in large vats, creating splashing and squashing sounds, or by mechanical presses that would creak and groan as they extracted juice from the grape harvest. The preservation of vegetables through drying would add subtle but constant sounds throughout the autumn months. Vegetables hanging in drying areas would rustle gently in air currents, while those being smoked would create the soft crackling sounds of smouldering wood chips and the occasional hiss as moisture escaped from the drying foods. Autumn weather patterns would affect all these activities in audible ways. Early frost would create the sharp crackling sounds of ice forming on surfaces, while the changing wind patterns of autumn would create new acoustic effects as they interacted with castle architecture. Autumn rains would be different from summer storms, often steadier and longer lasting, creating the persistent drumming of water on stone that could continue for days at a time. Winter ice could make wall walks treacherous for guards, while summer heat could make wearing armor almost unbearable for extended periods. Spring mud could make castle approaches difficult for both friends and enemies, while autumn winds could affect the accuracy of arrows and other projectile weapons. The seasonal challenges of castle defense created their own acoustic signature. Winter guards would move more slowly and carefully along icy wall walks, their footsteps creating different rhythms as they tested each step for security. The sound of guards slipping and catching themselves would punctuate the night watches, while the scraping of ice-clearing tools would become routine sounds as pathways were maintained for defensive purposes. Summer heat would affect the sounds of armored guards in distinctive ways. Metal armor would expand in the heat, creating subtle ticking and clicking sounds as joints moved differently. Guards would breathe more heavily, and the sound of perspiration dripping onto stone would become audible during the quietest periods of watch duty. The need for more frequent water breaks would increase the sounds of guards moving to and from water sources, while the heat would require changes in watch schedules that would alter the traditional rhythms of castle security. Spring mud would create unique challenges and sounds for castle approaches. The squelching and sucking sounds of feet and hooves in deep mud would announce the approach of visitors long before they came into view. Cartwheels would struggle in the mud, creating distinctive grinding and scraping sounds as they fought for traction. The cleaning of muddy boots and equipment would become a major activity, with scraping and washing sounds echoing through courtyards as people attempted to remove the persistent spring mud from their belongings. Autumn winds would affect not only military activities, but also daily life throughout the castle. Strong winds would create haunting sounds as they interacted with castle architecture, while also affecting the behavior of flags, banners, and any cloth material. The snapping and flapping of fabric in autumn winds would create sharp, irregular percussion throughout the castle complex. These same winds could affect the accuracy of defensive weapons, and guards would need to account for wind direction and strength when positioning themselves for optimal defensive coverage. The seasonal rhythms of castle life created a natural calendar that governed everything from military campaigns to social celebration. Understanding these rhythms was essential for castle administrators, who had to plan food storage, fuel supplies, and maintenance activities around the predictable challenges of each season. The administrative sounds of seasonal planning would become intense during transition periods between seasons. The scratching of quills on parchment would increase as inventories were taken and plans were. The clinking of counting tokens and coins would mark the calculation of resources needed for each season. Meetings between administrators would create intense discussion sounds as problems were identified and solutions debated. Storage areas would be reorganized seasonally, creating the sounds of heavy containers being moved, the rustle of protective coverings being applied or removed, and the systematic checking of stored goods for signs of spoilage or damage. These organizational activities would create their own seasonal rhythms, with different sounds marking the preparation for each upcoming season. As we reach the end of our peaceful journey through the world of medieval castle defenses, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable ingenuity and determination of the people who created these magnificent fortresses. These weren't just military installations, They were complete communities, carefully designed to sustain life and maintain security through some of the most challenging periods in European history. Many of the defensive principles developed by medieval architects and engineers continue to influence military construction today. The concept of layered defenses, the importance of controlling approach routes, and the psychological impact of imposing fortifications remain relevant in modern security planning. The engineering principles embedded in medieval castle construction represent some of humanity's most sophisticated early attempts at integrated defensive systems. The concept of defense in depth, creating multiple layers of protection that would slow and weaken attackers even if outer defenses were breached, remains fundamental to modern military thinking. Modern fortress design, bunker construction, and even cybersecurity protocols echo the medieval understanding that single-point defenses are vulnerable, while layered systems provide resilience and flexibility. The acoustic engineering of medieval castles, whether intentional or not, created sophisticated early warning systems that modern designers study and admire. The way sound traveled through castle structures provided information about activities throughout the complex, while the acoustic properties of different architectural features created natural communication networks that allowed coordination across large fortress complexes. These principles influenced the design of military installations for centuries and continue to inform modern security architecture. The mastery of material science demonstrated by medieval castle builders was remarkable for its time and remains impressive today. The understanding of how different types of stone would weather, how mortar compositions would perform in various climates, and how architectural forms would respond to stress and age required both theoretical knowledge and practical experience that took generations to develop. Modern structural engineers studying medieval buildings often find sophisticated solutions to engineering problems that predate formal engineering education by centuries. Water management systems in medieval castles represented advanced hydraulic engineering that solved complex problems of supply, distribution, and waste management within confined space. The acoustic signatures of these water systems, the sounds of wells, cisterns, and drainage networks, reflected sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics and pressure management. These systems often continue to function effectively for centuries, and many remain operational today, testament to the engineering skill of their creators. Perhaps most remarkably, many medieval castles have survived to the present day, their massive walls still standing as testament to the skill of their build. Walking through these ancient fortresses today, we can still hear echoes of their medieval past, the sound of footsteps on worn stone stairs, the whisper of wind through arrow slits, and the sense of permanence and security that these structures were designed to provide. The acoustic archaeology of surviving castles provides unique insights into medieval life that written records cannot capture. The way sounds behave in these spaces, how voices carry through corridors, how footsteps echo in courtyards, how wind creates musical effects in architectural features, gives us direct sensory connections to the experiences of people who lived centuries ago. These acoustic experiences remain largely unchanged, allowing modern visitors to share sensory experiences with medieval inhabitants in ways that are impossible with most other aspects of historical life. The wear patterns on stone stairs and walkways tell stories of countless feet that climbed and descended over centuries of use. Each step creates its own acoustic signature, and the accumulated wear patterns reveal the most frequently used paths through castle complex. Guards walking their rounds wore smooth grooves in stone walkways, while the irregular wear patterns around doorways and gathering spaces reveal the social patterns of medieval castle life. Many castle wells still echo with the same acoustic properties they possessed centuries ago. Dropping a stone into these wells today produces the same sounds that medieval inhabitants would have heard, and the depth and quality of these echoes often remain unchanged. These wells serve as acoustic time capsules, preserving exact sound experiences across centuries. The restoration and maintenance of surviving castles requires understanding of both historical construction techniques and modern conservation principles. The sounds of modern restoration work, power tools, machinery, and contemporary construction techniques create interesting contrasts with the hand tool construction sounds that originally built these structures. Yet many restoration projects deliberately use traditional techniques and tools, recreating the original construction soundscapes as part of authentic historical preservation. The people who lived and worked in these castles faced challenges that most of us can barely imagine, yet they created communities that could survive for months under siege, while maintaining complex social relationships and cultural tradition. Their story reminds us of human resilience and the power of collective effort in the face of adversity. Medieval castle communities were complete societies in miniature, with all the complexity, cooperation, and occasional conflict that characterizes human social organization. The acoustic evidence of these communities, the sounds of their work, their celebrations, their conflicts, and their daily interactions, reveals social structures and relationships that might not be fully captured in written records. The sounds of hierarchy and equality, of cooperation and competition, of individual expression and group conformity, all played out within the stone walls of these fortress communities. The intergenerational nature of castle communities meant that many inhabitants were born, lived their entire lives, and died within the same stone walls. Children growing up in castles would know every acoustic signature of their home environment, which footsteps belonged to which people, what different bell signals meant, how weather changes would affect the sounds of their daily lives. This intimate acoustic knowledge created deep connections between people and place that modern, more mobile societies rarely experience. The preservation of cultural traditions within castle communities required adaptive approaches that could maintain continuity while responding to the practical constraints of fortress life. Musical traditions, storytelling practices, and seasonal celebrations all had to be modified to work within the acoustic environments of stone buildings and confined spaces. The sounds of these adapted cultural practices, modified musical performances, stories told in echoing halls, celebrations contained within courtyards, created unique cultural expressions that were distinctly shaped by castle environment. The role of sound in maintaining social order within castle communities was crucial and complex. The authority of the castle lord was communicated through acoustic signals, horn calls, bell patterns, and verbal commands that carried specific meanings understood by all inhabitants. The acoustic privacy available to different social classes varied dramatically, with nobles enjoying relative quiet in their private chambers, while servants and soldiers lived in acoustic environments where privacy was almost impossible. The psychological impact of castle architecture extended far beyond their immediate defensive functions. These structures were designed to inspire feelings of security in their inhabitants, while projecting power and deterring potential attackers. The acoustic environments of castles played crucial roles in these psychological effects, creating soundscapes that could comfort or intimidate depending on one's relationship to the fortress. For inhabitants, the sounds of a well-functioning castle provided constant reassurance of security and order. The regular rhythms of guard patrols, the familiar sounds of daily work routines, and the acoustic signals that marked safe times and dangerous alerts all contributed to psychological environments that supported community stability, even during uncertain times. These sound patterns created what modern psychologists might recognize as secure acoustic environments that promoted mental health and social cohesion. For potential attackers, the acoustic properties of castles were often intimidatingly impressive. The way sounds carried from castle walls could make defender numbers seem larger than they actually were, while the echoing effects of voices and movements could create confusion about defensive preparations. The psychological warfare aspects of castle acoustics were sophisticated, using sound to project strength and determination while concealing weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The acoustic isolation that castles could provide during siege situations created unique psychological challenges and adaptations. Cut off from the outside world, castle communities had to maintain morale and social stability, using only the acoustic resources available within their walls. This led to the development of siege-specific cultural practices, songs, stories, and acoustic traditions designed to maintain hope and solidarity during the most challenging time. Modern psychological research into environmental acoustics confirms many of the intuitive understandings that medieval castle designers demonstrated. The relationship between acoustic environments and feelings of security, the importance of familiar sound patterns in maintaining psychological stability, and the ways that acoustic isolation can affect mental health were all challenges that medieval communities had to address through practical experience and cultural adaptation. The technological innovations developed for castle construction and defense often found applications far beyond military purposes. Construction techniques developed for castle building influenced civilian architecture, while defensive technologies contributed to developments in metallurgy, engineering, and manufacturing that benefited broader society. The acoustic technologies embedded in castle design, though often developed intuitively rather than through formal acoustic science, contributed to understanding of sound propagation, architectural acoustic, environmental sound management, that influenced later developments in building design. The great halls of castles, with their sophisticated acoustic properties for speech and music, served as prototypes for later concert halls and public speaking venues. The mechanical engineering required for castle construction, pulley systems, lifting devices, and construction machinery pushed the boundaries of medieval mechanical knowledge and contributed to technological developments that had wide-ranging applications. The sounds of this machinery, creaking windlasses, grinding gear systems, and the rhythmic operation of construction devices, marked significant advances in human technological capability. Castle water systems represented advanced hydraulic engineering that contributed to broader understanding of water management, pressure systems, and fluid dynamics. The acoustic properties of these systems, the sounds of flowing water, operating pumps, and hydraulic controls, reflected sophisticated technological understanding that influenced later developments in civil engineering and municipal water systems. The metallurgical advances required for castle defense, improved armor, better weapons, and stronger construction materials, drove innovations in material science that had applications throughout medieval society. The sounds of advanced metal working, more sophisticated forging techniques, improved tempering processes, and better alloy combinations marked technological progress that benefited agriculture, manufacturing, and daily life as well as military application. Medieval castles served as centers for the preservation and development of cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost during periods of social upheaval. The acoustic environments of castles provided unique venues for musical performance, storytelling, and ceremonial activities that helped maintain cultural continuity across generations of political and social change. The great halls of castles, with their distinctive acoustic properties, influenced the development of musical forms and performance practices that were specifically adapted to these environments. The sounds of music in stone halls, with their long reverberation times and complex acoustic interactions, created performance traditions that influenced medieval music composition and arrangement. These acoustic influences can still be heard in musical forms that developed from medieval castle performance traditions. Castle libraries and scriptoriums preserved not only written knowledge, but also the acoustic traditions associated with learning and scholarship. The sounds of medieval education, reading aloud, debate and discussion, and the copying of manuscripts took place in acoustic environments that influenced how knowledge was transmitted and understood. The quiet, focused acoustic environments of castle study areas provided optimal conditions for intellectual work that were rare in medieval society. Religious observances within castle communities created unique acoustic traditions that blended military, domestic, and spiritual acoustic elements. Castle chapels had to accommodate both intimate personal worship and large community ceremonies, creating acoustic requirements that influenced religious musical traditions and architectural design. The sounds of castle religious life, bell patterns, choral music, and ceremonial activities developed distinctive characteristics that differed from both cathedral and parish church tradition. The seasonal celebrations and social activities of castle communities, created acoustic traditions that reflected the unique social environment of fortress life. These celebrations had to work within the acoustic constraints of stone buildings and enclosed courtyards, leading to distinctive forms of entertainment and social interaction that were specifically adapted to castle environment. The principles of community organization, resource management, and collective security that medieval castles embodied continue to offer insights for modern community planning and social organization. The acoustic dimensions of these lessons, how sound environments affect community cohesion, communication, and social stability, remain relevant for contemporary urban planning and architectural design. Modern architectural acoustics owes much to the intuitive understanding of sound that medieval castle builders demonstrate. The ways that different materials, architectural forms, and spatial arrangements affect acoustic environments were mastered through centuries of practical experience that modern acoustic engineers study and apply. The acoustic comfort and functionality of contemporary buildings often reflects principles that were first worked out in medieval castle construction. The relationship between security and community that medieval castles achieved through design remains a model for contemporary security planning. The ways that physical design can promote both safety and social interaction, the importance of creating acoustic environments that support community communication while maintaining privacy, and the balance between protective features and quality of life are all challenges that modern communities face and that medieval castle communities successfully address. The resource management systems that allowed castle communities to survive extended periods of isolation offer models for contemporary sustainability planning. The acoustic signatures of these systems, the sounds of water conservation, food preservation, and waste management, reflected sophisticated understanding of resource cycles and conservation principles that remain relevant for the modern environmental planning. The social organization required to maintain complex castle communities during both peaceful and crisis periods demonstrates the importance of clear communication systems, shared cultural understanding, and adaptive leadership. The acoustic elements of these social systems, the sound signals that coordinated activities, the acoustic privacy that supported social hierarchy, and the acoustic traditions that maintained cultural continuity, provide insights into how communities can maintain stability and cohesion during challenging times. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself in one of these medieval castles, safe behind thick walls, listening to the gentle sounds of guards walking their rounds, the distant crackle of torches, and the peaceful rhythm of a fortress at rest. These ancient stones have watched over countless nights of peaceful sleep, and their legacy continues to inspire feelings of security and permanence, even today. The nighttime soundscape of a medieval castle was a carefully orchestrated symphony of security and peace. As daylight faded and the great gates were secured for the night, the castle would settle into its evening rhythms with acoustic signatures that spoke of safety and order. The last activities of the day would gradually fade, the final clatter of dishes being cleaned in the kitchens, the soft murmur of evening prayers in the chapel, and the gentle sounds of families settling into their sleeping quarters. The transition from day to night in a castle was marked by distinctive acoustic signals that everyone understood. The evening bell would toll, its bronze voice carrying across the courtyards and announcing that the working day was ended. The great gates would be closed with the heavy thud of massive wooden doors and the metallic click of iron locks and bars being set in place. These sounds provided psychological comfort to castle inhabitants, marking the beginning of the secure nighttime hours when the outside world was held at bay. Guard rotations would create the gentle, rhythmic sounds that became the nighttime heartbeat of castle life. Footsteps on stone walkways would mark the regular patrols, their steady rhythm providing constant reassurance that protective vigilance was being maintained throughout the night. The soft exchange of passwords between guards, the gentle clink of keys and weapons, and the whispered reports of all is well, would punctuate the nighttime hours with quiet confirmations of security. The acoustic environment of sleeping castles was filled with the subtle sounds of stone buildings settling for the night. As temperatures dropped, Stone walls would contract slightly, creating gentle creaking and settling sounds that were as familiar and comforting to castle inhabitants as the sound of wind in trees might be to country dwellers. These sounds spoke of solid construction and enduring protection, creating an acoustic embrace that helped inhabitants feel secure throughout the night. Torches and oil lamps would provide gentle crackling and flickering sounds throughout the night, their acoustic signatures varying with the fuel being used and the construction of the lighting fixtures. These sounds created acoustic anchors throughout the castle, helping people navigate in the darkness and providing comfort through their familiar presence. The gentle hiss of oil lamps and the occasional pop of torch flames added texture to the nighttime soundscape, without disrupting the overall sense of peaceful quiet. Castle inhabitants would fall asleep to sounds that connected them to both immediate security and distant tranquility. The night sounds of the surrounding countryside, owls calling, distant water flowing and the whisper of wind through trees, would filter into the castle courtyards, creating connections to the natural world beyond the protective wall. These sounds provided psychological balance, preventing the fortress environment from feeling too isolated or confined. The dreams of castle inhabitants were likely influenced by the unique acoustic environment in which they slept. The solid, protective sounds of stone construction, the regular rhythms of security patrols, and the distant connections to the natural world would create sleeping environments that promoted feelings of safety and stability. Modern sleep research suggests that consistent, low-level background sounds that indicate security and order can promote deeper, more restorative sleep, conditions that medieval castles provided naturally through their design and operation. Children growing up in castles would develop deep psychological associations between these nighttime sounds and feelings of safety and home. The acoustic signatures of their castle homes would become embedded in their earliest memories, creating lifelong connections between specific sounds and feelings of security. These early acoustic experiences would influence their understanding of what constituted safe, comfortable environments throughout their lives. While we may no longer need such formidable fortifications, the principles behind their construction, careful planning, attention to detail, and the creation of strong communities remain as relevant today as they were 800 years ago. The concept of perfect security that medieval castles pursued was never truly achievable, but the attempt itself created remarkable innovations in architecture, engineering, and social organization. The acoustic elements of these security systems, the early warning capabilities built into castle design, the communication networks that connected different parts of the fortress, and the psychological comfort provided by familiar protective sounds, represented sophisticated understanding of how environmental design could support human security needs. Modern security systems still struggle with many of the same fundamental challenges that medieval castle designers faced. How to create protection without creating isolation, how to maintain vigilance without creating anxiety, and how to balance individual privacy with community security. The acoustic solutions that medieval castles developed for these challenges continue to influence modern security design, from the acoustic early warning systems in contemporary buildings to the environmental sound design that helps modern spaces feel both secure and comfortable. The planning principles embedded in castle construction, the integration of multiple defensive systems, the redundancy that ensured continued function even when some elements failed, and the long-term thinking that created structures capable of serving communities for centuries, offer models for contemporary planning challenges. Whether addressing climate change, urban development, or technological infrastructure, modern planners can learn from the comprehensive, long-term approaches that medieval castle builders mastered. The attention to detail that castle construction required, from the precise fitting of stones to the acoustic properties of different architectural features, reflects a level of craftsmanship and care that modern construction often struggles to match. This attention to detail was not merely aesthetic, it was essential for creating structures that could perform their protective function reliably over long periods of time. The acoustic evidence of this craftsmanship can still be heard in surviving castles, where the precision of construction creates acoustic environments that remain functional and pleasant centuries after their completion. The creation of strong communities within castle walls demonstrates the importance of social design in creating successful settlements. The acoustic dimensions of these communities, the ways that castle design supported both group activities and individual privacy, acoustic traditions that maintained cultural continuity, and the sound environments that promoted social cohesion, offer insights into how physical environments can support healthy community development. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the world, these ancient guardians still stand watch, their stones holding the memories of countless generations who found safety and security within their protective embrace. The image of ancient stones standing eternal watch captures something profound about human aspirations for permanence and security in an uncertain world. These medieval fortresses represent more than historical curiosities. They embody fundamental human desires for protection, community, and continuity that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The stones of surviving castles have indeed become guardians of memory, preserving not only their own construction techniques and defensive capabilities, but also the intangible heritage of the communities they sheltered. The acoustic memories embedded in these stones, the echoes of countless conversations, celebrations, conflicts, and quiet moments, create connections across centuries that allow modern visitors to experience direct sensory links to medieval life. The protective embrace that these ancient fortresses provided to their inhabitants extends symbolically to modern times, offering psychological comfort through their continued existence and their representation of human capability to create enduring security. The knowledge that these structures have survived wars, natural disasters, and centuries of change, while continuing to provide shelter and inspiration, demonstrates the possibility of creating lasting solutions to fundamental human needs. The memories held within castle stones include not only the dramatic moments of siege and celebration, but also the countless ordinary days of peaceful life, the routine sounds of daily work, the quiet conversations of families, the gentle rhythms of seasonal change, and the comfortable patterns of community life that represented the successful achievement of the security these fortresses were designed to provide. As modern people face contemporary challenges that sometimes seem overwhelming, the example of medieval castle communities offers reassurance that humans have successfully created secure, sustainable communities, even during some of history's most difficult periods. The acoustic legacy of these communities, the sounds of cooperation, resilience, and hope that once filled castle courtyards, continues to inspire confidence in human capability to build better, safer worlds. The eternal watch that these ancient guardians maintain is not merely a poetic metaphor, but a practical reality. Many castle sites continue to serve their communities as museums, cultural centers, and gathering places that preserve historical knowledge while providing contemporary benefit. Their acoustic environments continue to host human activities, concerts, ceremonies, and educational programs that maintain living connections between past and present. The soft, peaceful fade to complete silence that ends our journey through medieval castle life represents not an ending, but a transition from the active, bustling sounds of daily castle life to the quiet, contemplative peace that these ancient spaces can still provide. This silence is not empty but full of potential, holding space for rest, reflection, and the renewal that comes from understanding our connections to the generations who came before us, and who created the foundations upon which our contemporary lives are built. In this silence, we can hear the whispers of history and the promise of continuity that these ancient stones represent. The medieval castle stands as a testament to human ingenuity, community cooperation, and the enduring desire to create spaces where life can flourish safely and peacefully. Their legacy continues to influence how we think about security, community, and the relationship between human needs and architectural design.